Hello and welcome to another episode of Faith Talk, where we talk all things theology, religion, and life's tough questions. I'm Oliver, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host Payton.
Hey everyone. Yeah, so today, I forgot there for a second what I was doing. So I'm just happy to be here because today we have Mr. Peter Fackenthall, the principal from Auburn Adventist Academy, on here, and we're going to talk about something that I think has impacted both of our lives. It kind of has to have impacted both of our lives, but that's a good thing, and that would be Adventist education. Now, on every episode, we always want to ask our guests what you believe about those questions, theology, religion, life, tough questions. So that'll get us into kind of going into this conversation. So Tell us a little bit about your worldview.
Worldview is a very interesting thing that I think I hadn't really dived into in probably the last 10 years and really analyzing for myself. And then once I did, I started to understand that I had a very specific worldview.
Yeah.
And that worldview, as we're talking about Adventist education, and as you guys mentioned, has to be connected to my own experience, both as a student and then as an educator/student while I've been in Adventist education. My worldview comes from I love being involved in the conversations about the world around me. I love to be able to infuse into all the conversations the ability to bring Jesus Christ or the values, the principles, the standards of the gospel story into my worldview. So then when I look at current issues on a daily basis, and I was just talking the other day about a major topic with my wife and my parents, I try to see and feel Christ's unconditional love even while I'm trying to express a very passionate and firm belief, while I make sure that the message is graciously presented so that others can consider what I'm thinking. My worldview falls back on, and I think you guys have heard this, I've mentioned it repeatedly, John 13, 34, and 35. Unconditional love. Love one another. That's transformative. So, besides Adventist education, I realized then when I was out of Adventist education as a career, when I moved people, they still needed me to love them a whole bunch on that day of their move, because we had the opportunity to take one of the most stressful experiences of their life and make it very peaceful, very comforting, and very well received in the demeanor that we brought. I think that would be one of the things. My worldview of that unconditional love hopefully affects my demeanor and how I relate to other people.
Yeah. At the end of the day, that's what it's all about. It's that unconditional love reflecting Christ's character.
Yeah.
You can have these lists of rules, but none of it matters if you don't show that love.
So something interesting you mentioned right at the beginning too is you said you didn't really start thinking a whole lot about it until more recently. One of the things you can always say about worldview is that most people don't even know they have it.
Correct.
So it's a key. What I thought of when you said all of that was, once you know you have it, you're more able and equipped to do those things you just said, to show that unconditional love once you realize and acknowledge and are conscious of it, which is extremely important.
I think it helps to identify your own personal mission. And it goes beyond just living accidentally to living with purpose. And that was a conversation. I actually had a conversation with a good friend of mine about, they were talking about how my worldview, my wife's worldview has affected our daughter's worldview.
Of course,
And that in turn, I hope and pray that I've done the right thing as a father so that they have that foundation to live a worldview. So very interestingly, and kind of squirreling for just a second, 2 words, gentle and kind.
Right.
Because a 2-year-old and a 3-year-old understands gentle.
That's right.
And they understand kind. Well, that's unconditional love. So that tied in.
Well, there's so much we can go into with the topic of Adventist education. I mean, we could go into a little bit first, I guess. So we already mentioned you're a principal at Auburn Adventist Academy. You briefly mentioned there your trucker days, which I'm sure we'll get into a little bit because we can't have you on here without talking about that.
Hey.
But you've been in Adventist education for how long?
So if I did all the math all the way through, as a career, I'm now finishing, this is my 18th year.
18th year.
Yeah. Wow. This is my second time. This is my 5th year at Auburn, the second time around. My first 5 years, I had Oliver's mom and her sister and others as students back in the 90s. And then the other 8 years would be the 8 years I was down at PUC Prep in California.
Okay.
Then, though, if you go back and do all of the, how many years of college, how many years of grade school, because you guys are going into, 13 years together?
Well, exactly. Yeah, going into that, too, because we've both been impacted because we've been in the same Adventist education system
pretty much all our lives.
13 years. Yeah. It basically, all the formative years.
So you don't really remember life without each other?
No, not really.
Not really.
As far back as I can remember.
Yeah,
I mean, stuck with this guy.
Yeah. Yeah, we've been in the same school as each other, and we've been in Adventist education the whole time too. And with those things going together, I think is honestly kind of why we're here today. Because we're sitting here doing this podcast. I don't know if we'd be doing this if we were in the public education system.
I understand. Especially not the topic.
Of course
Possibly not the topic.
Yeah. I mean, we may have been friends. We may have even done something like a podcast, but it's very unlikely that this mug would say Faith Talk on it if we were in the public education system. Because these opportunities have been allowed to us in this system.
So is that intentional or is that accidental?
Well, I think it's absolutely God's plan, right?
Oh, yeah.
You'd say so.
I've always, for me, I've been a firm believer of I wouldn't say, not Calvinistic view, but I always believe that things happen for a reason.
Right.
Well, right. It's God doesn't, going off Calvinism a little bit, as this is a theology podcast, God doesn't force us to step, but he does direct our path.
Oh, absolutely.
And I've seen that. I mean, I know for a fact that I was meant to be here at Auburn. I know for a fact that I was meant here to be where I was for middle school and grade school because it has shaped me to who I am today. Yeah. And I will eternally be grateful that not only for God directing that path, but for my parents following his will for my path in sending me and making the sacrifices they did to put me here, as well as all the educators who've been involved in that journey as well.
It's a feeling. It's just you know that you're on the right path. You know that you're supposed to be here.
And you know when you're not.
Right.
I kind of intimated in class, God kind of affirming. 3 or 4 weeks ago, I was like, whoops, I think I made a wrong turn a couple of days ago. And it wasn't anything profound. It wasn't anything that was going to make the news. But I did a 180. And when I got back on, I'm like, oh, yeah. Oh, this is where I'm supposed to be. And it just affirmed again for me that God he wants to present in front of you the option to live a godly life.
Yeah. That's really important to think that it's the option. And what we're talking about here is great, is that we've seen the good options. And I would say in the vast majority of situations. There have certainly been times, though. I mean, I can look through my past and say, okay, in such and such situation, I kind of knew what God wanted me to do. Right. I didn't do it.
Right.
I flip a UE now because
you recognize it.
I recognize, that's why God didn't want me to do that. But then in other situations, I can remember one of the most vivid times I can remember deeply praying and contemplating was deciding where to go for high school. Yeah. And I'm grateful that I lived in a household where my parents did allow me to be part of that decision.
Give you that option.
They said, if you want to be at Auburn, you'll be at Auburn. If you want to be somewhere else, you'll be somewhere else.
Interesting.
And I just, at the time, I felt, God wants me here. Yeah. Now I know God wanted me to be here.
Right.
It's like that one quote that you always bring up. I don't remember how it goes. It was like, if I had God's power to change everything, and I'm paraphrasing here, but I'd change a lot. But then if I had his knowledge, I wouldn't change anything.
Yeah, exactly. It's I can't remember. It's from a saint. I always forget his name. From a few centuries ago, he essentially said, if I had his omnipotence for a day, you'd see the changes I'd make in the world. Right. But if he gave me his wisdom too, I would leave things as they are. And that's powerful to think about.
Right. Because that's brought you to where you are today. Our whole life has brought us to this table right now.
Yeah. The good and the bad.
With the good and the bad.
Yeah.
And like you said, and Adventist education, ironically.
Yeah.
Our paths wouldn't have crossed except for the school across the street. Yeah. And the mission and intent of that. Yeah. Good stuff.
Yeah. It's crazy to think about. It's always fun to play that what if game.
What if?
It is, isn't it?
Yeah.
We I think there's some danger in playing the what if game, though, because once you do, first of all, we can't change the past.
Right.
And second of all, like we kind of just said, would we even want to? No, I don't think we would. It's kind of fun to think about, but in the end, you can't and you won't.
Correct. Remember my cousin who came in and he was in class, Lewis Cack that came in.
Yep.
And I was hiking with him and I was talking about that. And I was lamenting the time between high school and college where I didn't know what I wanted to do. So I failed out of school. I failed out of an Adventist university. I failed out of a community college just because I quit. I didn't know what to do. And we're hiking, he and my brother and I said, commenting, saying, "Man, I wish I had gone 4 years in the military." Somebody giving me some discipline, or I wish I had known this factor, or if I'd only known that I wanted to go into education earlier. So he very wisely, this was 15, 20 years ago, he goes, "But Peter, that would mean that you'd be a different person than you are today."
Yeah.
And I thought, and I sat there, and I was like, "Well, I'm pretty blessed with where God has brought me today, so I can't what if myself out of current happiness."
Yeah.
Don't what if yourself away from the mission that God wants you to do right now.
That sure. To give an analogy that kind of resonates with people today, I mean, you look at the latest Marvel movies that have been diving into this a lot. Literally, there was a show, What If, and then in the more recent movies, they've been showing that where you, in these fictional worlds, you have people jumping from reality to reality where they see exactly that. What would your life be like if this thing were to change, or if this thing were to change? And you see that butterfly effect. And the butterfly effect is kind of what we're talking about here. Okay. And one of my favorite stories in all of Scripture is Genesis 50, when Joseph is sold into slavery, and then his father dies, and his brothers are terrified because they think, "Oh, this guy's going to kill us now because we sold him into slavery. Yeah. Now our dad's not here to get mad at him for that, so he's going to kill us." But instead, he just says, "What you meant for evil, God meant for good, the saving of many lives."
Sure.
And that's a butterfly effect moment. That's saying that God knows the bigger picture and we don't.
And it happens all the time. I mean, your mom being here as a student probably led for you being here as a student.
Yep.
When did you know you were going to be here at Auburn?
Not till like 7th grade maybe, and that's when I started think about it. But it
makes a big difference.
Right.
The ripple. You talk about that ripple in those moments. My first year here at the academy, I was out at graduation and walking around the field, seeing different families, saying hi and coming up to me, and families taking pictures. And this individual walked across the field, and probably a lady in her late 30s, and I didn't recognize her at all. Mm-hmm. She comes up and she goes, "Mr. Fackenthall." I'm like, "Yeah." She goes, "You don't recognize me." It was obvious on my face. And I was like, I don't. And she said something that, Payton, and both of you, as you gentlemen look at your lives and you look at where you're wanting to go moving forward, both conversation with your family, your parents, your siblings, the tone of your message, the reason that we get into prayer and worship, the reason that you're doing this podcast is to bring God into as many conversations. She goes, I was asked to leave Auburn my senior year. And at the end of that conversation, she goes, "You're vice principal that year." At the end of that conversation, you came up to me and you said, God has you. This moment in life does not define you." Mm-hmm. And we've heard that said before. But maybe until you hear it said to you, you don't quite understand the enormity of hearing that. And that this moment can help define your future. Mm-hmm. She was there. Her kids were involved with graduation. She was in the church. She was serving in ministry in a different way, not directly. Oh. And I don't remember her.
It's a lot of students.
To be fair
to you.
I kind of remembered the circumstances. Yeah. But her name specifically, she changed so much from childhood that it was a process where I'm thinking to myself, praise God. Yeah. That in that moment, my worldview, even though I didn't know it was my worldview yet, my worldview was this individual needs another chance. Yeah. This individual needs to know God's grace more than any punishment that might be coming towards them. They need to know God's grace. We'll take care of it moving forward. So that's a huge part of being in a Christian high school versus a secular high school setting, is to bring that conversation in always. And constantly bring it in place.
I just love the string that you look back, and that one of the things that has strengthened my faith, other than just because there's evidence through history, science, logic that really is powerful to me. But I would say almost equally as powerful is looking back at my life and seeing the evidence of God working in my life, because that's when it gets personal. Mm-hmm. And I just look back even farther than my generation or my mom's generation, back even further, to bring where we are today, because my grandparents were devout Catholics.
Interesting.
I have descendants from Ireland on my mom's side, that is. Right. and they were devout Catholics. And what happened was, and I want to make sure I get the story right, but my grandparents just went into a motorcycle repair shop to get the motorcycle repaired. Evidently, they had some sort of problem, and the guy in there was an Adventist. And whatever this guy did, however he talked to them, he convinced them, these devout Catholics, to start Bible studies. And they started Bible study, and then my grandparents became Catholics. And this was when my mom was 2 years old, became Adventist, I should say. My mom was like 2 years old.
Yeah.
And because of that motorcycle repair guy, my mom then went on to raise me as an Adventist, and then bringing me to where I am today, going through the Adventist system of education. So you just see these strings connected in ways that guy doesn't even know I exist.
Correct.
But look at what the impact he made.
That butterfly.
Yeah.
And so to connect on that financially, this hasn't been easy.
Oh yeah.
For you, your family, you both work. Probably part of your pay goes to help pay your tuition. And yet if you look at it as an investment, that investment, if your parents 13, 15 years ago could have said, our sons will be working on a podcast about God, about Jesus Christ, their senior year of high school, your parents probably would have said, how much do we have to pay? They would have said, if somebody had said to them, it's going to cost you $100,000. Well, it's not getting too far off. They probably would have said, sign it up. And that's going back to worldview, that's the question that Adventist education does ask of everybody. When people say, why should I do that? Why should I make that investment? I hearken it back to, and I shared this just at executive committee. I love pastoral ministry. I love my pastors. I think they're wonderful. I shared this at the board, the academy board. If you have a prayer and a worship, say in five classes during the day, you probably have prayer and worship probably in 5 classes, don't you?
Yeah, ideally, at least a prayer.
At least a prayer.
More. Yeah.
And then you have a Bible class. So then you have an in-depth study. You have a conversation. Then we have chapel. The amount of time that we have in the mission of education, the ministry of education, proportional to the ministry of pastoral ministry, which serves a whole nother facet of society, that amount of time is exponential. Yeah. It's huge. That's why I tell anybody, if they're thinking about pastoral ministry, Payton, to think about teaching, right? You with me, Oliver?
Yeah.
Right? To think about teaching, because how many conversations might God say, okay, this year it's this student in this conversation, but you'll never know.
Yeah.
But I need you there. And that's how I look at Adventist education. I look at it that way from the intentionality. From a quick example, my daughter went to pre-kindergarten. And she's in pre-kindergarten. We go to the Christmas program, or we go to a school program. And her class gets up. She's a very private little 4 or 5 year old. She gets up, and with her class, they recite the 23rd Psalm.
Wow.
And I'm looking at Joy, and Joy's looking at me. I'm looking at
Wow.
and we're like, did you know? Did you know? Neither of us knew that she was going to memorize the 23rd Psalm in pre-K.
That's really early.
Right? But their teacher had walked them through, and they had different mannerisms and things. That's that investment. Sign me up. I'll pay that.
Yeah.
Because it's a sacrifice to it's worth the sacrifice for the person, and then hopefully for that person to see, I want to make the world a better place because Jesus Christ helped the world be a better place with my school, with my family, with my church. Yeah. Anyway.
So here's some food for thought.
Yep.
You brought it. We've seen from your example, and there are many others out there, of how these little tiny minuscule things you wouldn't even think of have had rippling effects that have changed lives and brought us here today. So it makes you think, well, how many choices have I made in my past that have changed lives? And how many choices am I going to make, or can I make in the future, that will also change lives and cause that rippling effect?
And that goes kind of back to what we started off on when we asked you about your worldview. You described that unconditional love, because you got to think of it that way. In a way, it adds a little bit of weight to your life, but in the same time, it's relieving because you know God's got you. But in everything you say and do every day, you got to keep in mind, you never know whose life you might be impacting. Especially not sometimes you say, well, in the secular world, we got to do that because we got to influence people for the gospel. But You got to do that here too.
Yeah.
And, that's something that we experience here, because we're two examples who just loved our time, I think, in Adventist education, wouldn't take it back for the world.
Yeah.
There's some people who don't feel that way.
Sure.
So the way we act and the way we do life, even in the Adventist education system, we still have to spread the gospel just as anybody. Christians still got to hear the gospel just as much as
Correct.
anybody else.
Yeah. Well, even you just sharing this story right now at your senior year, for your peers to go, interesting. Maybe there's something that I should think about because I'm listening to these two gentlemen talk about how God has become part of their life. And it's a whole different game nowadays, isn't it? Because you have the chance to say this, even if you wouldn't necessarily do it in a class setting. Now you have the chance to sit behind these mics and talk about what that means, which I look forward. I think this will probably go on for a very long time, right?
Yeah, I hope
Good.
so.
Yeah.
Good.
It really is a blessing to have this platform, that have this voice to just share the gospel. Yeah.
Yeah, you got to count all these things as blessings. Outlook is really important because I could look back on my years of 13 years of Adventist education and say, oh, so restrictive, or oh, so this or that, and I could choose to view it negatively. Would that benefit me in any way, though? I don't think so. It's all about outlook, and I don't feel that way. Praise God.
Yeah.
Some people do, but even if you do feel that way, and I wrote in the Rainier Echoes, our school newspaper, an article to the graduating class of 2022.
Right.
And in there, I knew that there was going to be people in our class who maybe don't look so fondly back on their years at Auburn, however many years that may be. And I said in there, regardless of how you feel about it, I am confident that you can look back through your years and at least find some things that are positive. And I really think that regardless of what your worldview is, regardless of your time here, you got to admit that you've been blessed. You got to admit that money didn't go completely to waste.
Yeah.
That there's something of value here.
Yeah.
Otherwise, these schools wouldn't exist anymore.
Sure. And I would even say that it connects on that deeper personal level also. If this is something that you recognize as value to you, and you have that attachment, you have that connection with Jesus Christ, and that's a visceral relationship, then our life responsibility. So going back to my alumni weekends, not everybody's happy to be there. Not everybody wants to be on campus. I feel that part of my mission of service to my friends is to be a gentle reminder that, I have made I have chosen life to follow God. I have chosen to work in a private Christian school, sacrificed to work in a private Christian school, and it's been worth it. Even if that story hasn't been the same story, and I do believe that consistency of example, gentlemen, will allow your friends to reflect upon this down the road 10, 15 years. And I feel, actually right now, a strong attachment and connection that I want to make sure I connect with the generation that I don't know so well, kind of around the mid 10, 15, and say, hey, this is still your school. It will forever be your school. So remember those good memories. Yeah. Recall those good memories and bring them back.
Yeah, it is really important to count your blessings.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
You can look at life through this negative lens of, well, I'm not famous, I'm not rich, I don't have really nice fancy $500 shoes, you know, and then you can be depressed the rest of the day. But on the other hand, you can look at it as, well, I may not have $500 shoes, but I have shoes.
And it is.
So there are a lot of people out there who don't have shoes.
Yeah. My good friend, he's a hospitalist down in Portland, Oregon, a gentleman by the name of Tim Hill. I can say names, right?
Yeah, I'm just going to the internet.
Okay, that's true.
Your discretion.
So sophomore Bible. I'm in sophomore Bible, teaching sophomore Bible my second year here. I taught sophomore Bible for just my first 2 years, and we're talking about different things in sophomore Bible, and I don't know how it came up in my funny book or that Facebook at the beginning of the year for my senior year in high school. I had under my picture that all I wanted to do for my goal in life was simply be filthy rich, right? So I'm a second year teacher. I'm making nothing. I'm paying off school loans. And I mentioned that my goals had changed. My goals and objectives have changed. And Tim raises his hand, and he just raises it. And he's a deep thinker. He's a smart guy, very reflective. And he says, "But Mr. Fackenthall, you are." And I looked at them. I looked at this group of sophomores. First of all, I was shocked that a sophomore said something that mature. Right. No offense, sophomores, but you're 15, 16 years old.
Yeah.
But I sat there, and I remember that conversation. That conversation happened for me.
Yeah.
How ironic. All of a sudden, I was like, oh, yeah. Because I've been worried, I'm measuring my value by things when it was really, and it always has been, about people. Yeah. About the people you get to be in contact with.
Yeah, that's one of the crucial things. I think that students in the Adventist system will hear this, whether they'll actually take it to heart or not.
Right.
I don't know. Hopefully, when they're older, they will. But when you talk about the fact that you do indeed make massive sacrifices to do what you do, and that applies to every single person who works in the system. Right. I'm reading right now a book by Jordan Peterson called 12 Rules for Life. And one of his rules for life is make sacrifices, essentially. And that's a chapter I was just reading today. And he's saying, we live in a kind of a culture where it's instant gratification, where you get what you get and you want it right now.
You can Amazon it.
You can Amazon it, exactly. But what he talks about in this chapter, going into the psychology and philosophy of it, is we have learned over human history that if you make one sacrifice today, it can ripple forward and help you later. He uses the analogy of cave people and mammoths, saying that if I kill this mammoth, if I have a bunch of extra mammoth, well, what I could do is I could eat it all right now and be stuffed and then have no food next week, or I could save it for next week, or even better, I could give it to somebody now and then gain the trust of that person so that later that person trusts me and is able to help me later. Okay. So we ripple forward to make those connections of sacrifice. Yeah. Because sure, you're not filthy rich by whatever amount maybe is in your bank account, perhaps. Right. But for one, you're filthy rich in Christ when you're doing His work. Absolutely. And I think you see the fruits of that in what you do. Well, I've certainly seen the fruits of it.
I believe so, and it's a blessing to be part of that and to be looking at it that way. Yeah, good stuff. Can we talk finances a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah. because you guys both been paying a lot of money, and the being in school, being in a private school is part of it. When I interviewed for the job, somebody asked me on the board. They said, "So what percentage is mission? What percentage is business?" And I said, I give the tipping point, the majority vote, 51% to mission, but it's got to be 49% business. When you look at the sacrifice, again, that I mentioned earlier about going to school here, paying to go to school, there are high schools that teach really good classes. Oop, bumped the mic, didn't it? Okay. There's classes that you could have at your public school. They're going to be good classes. Yep. The sacrifice financially is huge. So I've got some goals. I kind of view myself, I'm 5 years in here. I like to view, I have some good years in front of me. My girls want to go to school here, so that's awesome. I want to build a financial system in the next 5 years that makes it possible without the deeper, there's a lot of machinations, a lot of conversations that go into scholarships, go into budget of the school. I think we have the opportunity in the next 5 years to build a financial system so that it's not a question. Anybody that wants to go to school here, whether they're within the Adventist community or outside the Adventist community, has the opportunity to do that, contributing their fair share, but then the system financially says, this mission is worth it. It's worth it that much to have this endowment, to have this amount of money in place, so that these conversations, like you talked about, these conversations can continue to happen, that you can write an article in the newspaper that points kids to Jesus Christ. So I've wondered sometimes about what my life calling is, and I wondered about that when I was driving truck, and I'm driving truck, since you mentioned trucking stories. I'm driving truck one day, and we're probably in Nebraska or Kansas, and Mrs. Fackenthall and I are talking, and a sign comes by on a billboard, school sale, come get your school supplies. I felt like an old racehorse. I was like, oh man, time to get going. But I'm driving a truck, and I'm committed to that for probably about 3 years then. And we're talking. I turned to her and I said, so why are we not teaching? Why are we not in school right now? What is it? And she said, similar to like what you said, well, God has a plan. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I sure wish I knew what it was, but God has a plan. Mm-hmm. I dare say that those million miles I spent driving gave me more thinking and praying time than I ever would have had if I'd been in a school coming into it. It allowed me to understand that the value of going back into Adventist education was worth the mission focus.
Right.
So financially, I feel it's important for me to communicate the message to the greater stakeholders in the conference and beyond, to alumni, to individuals that are looking for a cause, that the cause of Adventist education, Christian education, Jesus Christ in the school at Auburn Adventist Academy is worth people investing their time and energy. So there's a little commercial to that, because I think it's going to take your generation, the next generation, preparing to give a little bit sacrificially to be able to provide for that kid that's down there in kindergarten that doesn't know that they're going to be hosting the next podcast in 15 years.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
But if we don't do it now, if we don't build it now, we won't prepare to have the end result in 5 years.
Yeah.
So,
of course.
Yeah, there's a little bit about finances from my perspective.
Well, right. I mean, you mentioned there the kind of the why of when you were driving that truck and wondering why. Another thing, speaking of education, one of the things that I look back on my years here, given strategically where my high school experience was placed on the grand timeline of history, is that I was in school for the vast majority of my high school experience, in spite of the fact that it took place during the pandemic. That I don't know if we're going to get a thing on this video because we say the name, but COVID really impacted high schoolers in a lot of ways. But what I can say that was such a blessing, and I can honestly look back on, is one of the things I prayed for so much when we had those couple months at the end, which would have been at the time my sophomore year, when we got sent home, 2020, when we had those distance learning month or two, that summer I prayed like all the time, saying, please God, get me in school in person next year. Right. And the public schools weren't going back. The public schools were saying, no, we're not ready. But we were there. We may have had some crazy stuff to deal with when we were at school, but we were there. We were there almost the entire time, because again, that mission took priority. The school decided we need to be here, and we're gonna be here. And I've been blessed by the fact that we were able to. My family was able to send me to a place that had the mission of we're gonna be here, because there's a lot of people who were not in high school for a year and a half.
And that was a deep walk through religious liberty, freedom of individuals and organizations to say that we can manage this well.
There's your philosophy in religion, by the way.
Right, and it paid off. I think it paid off because I think we managed it well. I'm tired. Are you guys tired from having walked through COVID for the last 2 years? I'll tell you, if school had ended when we were able to take off our masks. Oh man! But we're doing it, and we're going to have a graduation that I only prayed about 6 months ago.
Me too. That's it. So I prayed that we'd be back in person, right? Yeah. And then the next step was God. And funny thing is, even though He did it for me the first prayer, even though the second time when I was praying, please God help me to be able to graduate without a mask, without the distancing, I thought it's not going to happen. I didn't believe that it was actually going to happen, and here we are. As of the recording of this, from 2 weeks out. As of the time you'd be listening to this, it's 3 days out.
Do you feel that even this technology here around this table and with this conversation, do you think that, or let me ask it this way, what do you feel that you learned that you wouldn't have experienced if we hadn't had this COVID experience?
Patience.
A
lot of waiting, a lot of
adaptability.
There you go.
So much. You said the technology. It for sure. Like I had literally never used Zoom, Google Meet, anything. No. I think the vast majority of people had never used that stuff. The most I'd done was FaceTime. I learned adaptability. I learned about myself a little bit of what worked about that and what didn't. But to the broader extent, talking about God's plan, what I learned was where my priorities were at.
Sure.
So when I was hit with that, then I started, that's what led me to where I am today, in a sense, that I started to study and to suddenly care about the priorities. Because before COVID, I didn't know much. I don't think I even knew what apologetics was.
Yeah.
I wasn't super strong in my faith.
Yeah.
I was a Christian, but I wasn't devout.
Yeah.
But when I realized, all the worldly things that were at one point my top priority are taken away from me, then I'm able to prioritize what really matters. And once again, I wouldn't think that it takes a pandemic for me to learn where my priorities are at. But God's plan, it's something else.
Oliver, you're a really patient guy from my perspective. So what did you mean? What patience did you add on that we don't know because we don't know your own conversation?
I think I would have to say definitely patience with my family.
Yeah. Okay.
Being around them all the time.
Right.
Yeah. I'd have to say, and just patience with just the surroundings and circumstances in general, because a lot of times life just throws unexpected things at you that I guess you're not always going to be ready for them, but in a sense you're always ready for them, if that makes sense. Like that I'm as ready as I'm ever going to be, right?
well and to that point, your generation I think will be like, I have to adapt.
Yep.
I did this when I was 16.
That's true.
I did this in a way that I never imagined when I was 16.
That's true.
And those are life-forming conversations. I keep searching. I'm going to continue to find ways that slow down my life. And it was hard. It was tragic and traumatic for many people. One thing that it did was slow down my life in a way that I was able to give emphasis to my family, that I'll be very direct. I'm not giving the same time now because we've gotten wonderfully back up to speed.
I can relate to that.
So praise God I've got the Sabbath, because if I didn't have the Sabbath, I'd be going 1,000 miles an hour.
Yeah.
So
I think one more thing I want to add to that real quick is also patience in God's timing.
Of course.
Faith in God includes faith in His timing. So I remember being there. I was like, "Yay, 2 weeks off of school, right?" And then it was 3 weeks.
Yeah.
Then it was 4 weeks. Then it was 5 weeks. I was like, "God, when is this gonna end?"
Yeah.
One thing that just gave me such a chuckle the other day, speaking of end of the year and graduation and education, is I was reading through this yearbook. Of course, it's my last high school yearbook. It's very important, so I read like every word in there. And I was reading one of a buddy of ours. He put his senior quote was, "We'll be back in 2 weeks." I got such a kick out of it.
Hey, what did we do? We said that like 3 or 4 times, didn't we? Where we did, okay, so we're going to take 2 weeks off.
Yeah. But I mean, going back to the conversation, something actually I was going to ask Oliver if he had the same experience as me, given the fact that this happened in our time in high school. Now we're coming out of this as young adults, we're about to graduate, we're going off to do different things. Do you feel that COVID forced you to mature?
I definitely.
Yes.
I would say so. 100%. Yeah, it was definitely a huge push, and I'd say definitely a push in the right direction.
Yep.
I don't know what I would be like if it didn't happen.
Interesting.
I totally think that it forced a lot of us to mature. We came back different. Many of us came back better.
Yeah.
And I think that, some of us were happy to be back in person. Some of us weren't. But I think if you take any statistical poll from the student body of students who lived through this, they'd say we were glad to be back. We were glad that we came back, because for months we were in person. Literally 6 feet apart, but we were in person. Well, all the public schools were still online.
Yeah.
And you've seen statistically, and I always say this in this conversation, that we haven't even begun to see the effects of that.
No.
Because, yes, COVID had its detrimental effects, but the effects of the lockdowns are also detrimental.
Correct.
You see the suicide rate going up. You see all these things. And I would like to think that maybe that rate would be less in our Adventist schools that came back sooner and gave those students what they needed, whether they realized it or not.
Because we've had core to what we believe is hope.
Yep.
Core to what we believe every day is hope. Interesting. I think that I feel that that's going to be a bit of a generational bump. Obviously, society is going to measure that in 20, 30 years.
You'll see the statistics in the future.
And wonder, and we're probably going to have some X points where certain elements of society were headed one way and other elements of society were headed another way. I know we are very blessed to be able to do it in a manner that both met the needs of students while still doing our best to meet the needs of the school, while also following to the best of our ability and the practices and expectations of us as an organization, which was not easy. Yes. And trust me, it was a growth experience for me in just governance, different forms of leadership, and just how our system is organized, and helped me identify that at the end of the day, I want to be able to continue to do better every day, but also know that I have committed myself to doing something that is sacrificial to the point where I need to humble myself to be ready to sacrifice a little bit more to fulfill the need that God wants to have done. And that's not easily, because vanity can come in. I've got a better idea. I've got a better solution. And sometimes I just had to pray and say, okay, Lord, I think I need to go this direction. I think the school needs to go this direction. And I think that for us, he brought us through better than I had imagined.
Yeah.
Better than I had imagined.
He really did.
Thrilled on that.
Yeah. Good. It's crazy that we came into our high school, and we're the last class here at the academy this year to go in for a full year of high school without any of this craziness, and we're the first class to graduate with basically none of it. We're coming out of it. Yeah. And I will forever be grateful that I got to live through that in a school that tried its very hardest to get us through that.
We talk about, and I talk to you guys in CWP about where your plans are, what you're thinking about. Somebody mentioned this to me again and reminded me. Do you remember your freshman year before spring break when we did those distance learning days before spring break? Because we could do that because we have Google Classroom. We didn't do anything online, but you had those assignments. One of the things I try to keep myself alerted to in my worldview and my mission is to be listening to what God may be asking me to do in 3 years, and what I need to do now to be ready to meet that need in 3 years. And that conversation, because we're able to bring it into the classroom and even into our life, I think it puts a different focus beyond just today. Yeah, there's things that have to happen today, but the decisions we're making today, the foundation for those decisions was made 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. Maybe it was made when I was asked as a student teacher doing history, and the student teacher, the principal that walked by, I'm at Walla Walla Valley Academy, and he walks by, John Deming, and he says, "Hey, Peter, get ready for administration." And I'm like, no, I want to teach. I want to have a 40-year career teaching. And he said, "Get ready for administration." Why did he say that while I'm doing my student teaching? Right? And I'm like, never, I won't do that. But then he planted a seed that, look what I'm doing now. So going back to Adventist Education, what are the seeds that God is planting, has already planted in your life, that's going to bear fruit? And I look at both of you and I see amazing things that are going to come of your life. That's really cool.
Yeah, I think kind of like you mentioned, and it's interesting that you brought up the idea that if you want your kids, this is even going into my thought process of my kids someday, what I want them to do. If you want them here, they'll be here, because if it's God's will, they'll be here. And I don't think Auburn Adventist Academy is the only school that has that mission in mind. I know that our system says, if it's God's plan for you to be here, if he wants you here, you're going to be here. And if you do come here, and if it is planned, it's going to be worth it. No matter what sacrifices you may have to make.
Going back to that idea that everything happens for a reason. God wants you on a path, and you know when you're on that path, you feel it. And once you're there, you're there.
So would you say, you got 2 weeks, 13 days?
Yeah.
I'm curious. This is your podcast. I'm passionate. I'm sold. I'm preaching to the choir because I'm talking to myself, or I'm sharing my own thoughts. What would you want to make sure was we've talked about all kinds of facets, but kind of to organize that outline, gentlemen, for your takeaway, what would you say is, in 2-3 sentences, is the greatest reason that parents should consider putting their kids in the Seventh-day Adventist high school in this setting, because that's what I know.
Yeah.
Why should they do it? So I can quote you, and I can go back and say, wait a minute, I got to go back to that podcast and get that quote from Payton, get that quote from Oliver.
I would definitely say because the connections you make are priceless.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the things that's actually going to continue to be with you after high school, is the connections you make
absolutely.
and the memories you formed with those people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think people that haven't experienced this, they don't even know what they're missing.
They don't.
They really don't. Yeah, it's really cool.
Yeah. Wow, you said 2 to 3 sentences.
Yeah.
One of the reasons I have a podcast is so that I don't have to keep myself to
Okay,
2
so
to 3
he
sentences.
made it. He made it. I think it was like a sentence.
2 or 3 sentences.
You can have his 2 extra sentences. Is that fair, Oliver?
I'll try to keep it.
Yeah.
Okay. So for one, I haven't experienced the public school system, but I would say the biggest thing is relationships for sure, but the fact that we talk about Jesus Christ in every single class.
Correct.
The fact that we can start Algebra 2 still talking about Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
And, my favorite part of biology class was talking about evolution and creation and Jesus Christ.
Right.
Christ-centered education. To sum it up, let's start the sentence here.
Okay. So we've done the brain.
Yeah, we've done the brainstorming. Now we're starting
Okay.
here. If you are a Christian, Christ is the center of your life.
Yes.
And Christ should be the center of your kids' education. And if they go to an Adventist school, they will experience an education that is a good education, that's challenging, that'll hold them to a high academic standard, but most importantly, will keep Christ at the center of all that they do.
Yeah. And that means we're perfect, right? I'm doing a perfect job.
Of course not.
That's why I was like, we're all human, and myself included, and
Of course.
And that's I think it's the journey. Goes back to the journey, the lifelong worldview journey.
That's one of the things I pray for every day. We kind of have those prayers that we say as kind of like a default prayer, but I like to change it up and make sure I mean it when I say it. One of the things I always say is, I pray, Lord, that everything I say and do will honor you.
Amen.
And when you're in a setting where you're allowed to make Christ the focus of everything you say and do, that's when it matters. My favorite quote is when C.S. Lewis said, Christianity is false, is of no importance, but if it's true, it's of infinite importance.
If it's true, it's beyond measure.
Yes,
Yeah.
and that's the key, is that if it's true, if you've decided to say, I believe that Jesus Christ rose from the dead, there's nothing that matters more.
Okay.
So, of course, you would want your child to be having an education with Christ at the center.
So I'm going to be doing some surveys which ask that. They're all curriculum surveys. We were building them before COVID. Now it's going to be it's going to be a Survey Monkey, and everybody's going to do it for their classes, kind of do it for their content areas, their teachers. And we look at both the classroom management, how much you learn, the teaching style, and we look at the mission, because every class has a mission. So beyond that survey, where I want to hear from people, what could we do better?
Yeah.
I would love to hear from you guys, for me to be able to take back to my team, my leadership team. What can we do better? What is it that Auburn, as we make plans for the next 5 years, what are some things that we should put in place to, and I believe this passionately, and I'm very willing, I think I want to make sure this becomes more centered to what we're doing. We believe that we need to elevate Jesus Christ even more.
I 100% agree.
So what could we do as the takeaways for that moving forward in the next 5 years? 5-year plan. Give me some, here we're around a table, could almost be like a kitchen table, kitchen conversation. What do I need to take into consider for my daughter will be a freshman in 2 years. She's in 7th grade right now. So what do I need to do to make the school more Christ-centered?
Ooh.
Y'all know
Put me on the spot here.
Yeah.
I know as a school we always have week of prayer, but one of the ideas that just popped into my mind is maybe once a week during one of the chapel periods is just have a worship or a time of prayer or something like that.
Interesting.
Yeah. That's just one of the ideas popped in there.
And probably invite people that want to do that.
Right.
That's interesting, because I'm always surprised when we give people a chance to just come and pray.
Mm-hmm.
How many do, and how many come and stay, just listen, and they're there, and how many stay.
Yeah.
That's good. I like that. Thank you, Oliver.
Yeah. There's a lot of ideas that float around in my head as I've been here for really the past 2 years, focusing on what can we do to make things better. And one big thing, I think, for one, like you just mentioned, elevate Jesus Christ even more.
Yeah.
Right. So we've done a lot, because what you got to focus on when you're doing ministry in any setting is what is the most pressing matters on the mind of the people you're ministering to. So one huge thing that I've seen our system do quite well in a lot of ways is dealing with the mental health issues that the students deal with today. What I think is fantastic is that we do address it, that we're not afraid to address it, and that's good. I think one thing that could always be improved, that will never be perfect, is in those conversations about mental health, make sure that the center of it is always Jesus Christ. Because, and I've given sermons on this before, they're always the sermons I'm most afraid to give because of how it resonates with people. But when we just go around saying, you're enough, you're enough, you're enough, that's baseless, without saying that, but because what I always say is I flip it and say, you're not enough, but with Christ, you're more than enough. So what I find a lot in conversations about mental health is, and it's the biggest thing on the minds of students these days, as we see through statistics and through my interpersonal relationships, if you keep Jesus Christ at the center, it's going to be better. And it's hard to even say exactly how that will work and function, but I just know that keeping Christ at the center is number one. And kind of going along with what Oliver said about worship, my one thing is always, I never want to mandate it. I never want to require it, because then it's not real worship. But more opportunities for that. I think Power Pack weekends and week of prayer and all of these things, again, that are the best parts about Adventist education. The fact that you don't get a week of prayer or a Power Pack weekend at a public school. No. But at an Adventist education, you get to say, oh, today's a weird schedule. Yeah, we got a lot of weird schedules. But
we do that really well, don't we?
Yeah. So. But because of that, we get to go hear so-and-so preach, or we get to go sing. Even as someone who doesn't like singing, I still look forward to worshiping, and that includes the music especially, during a week of prayer. And the more we can do that, the better. Now, about requiring it, some people are going to be bitter over it, but that's why they're here.
But make the opportunity.
Yes. Okay. Absolutely.
So my takeaway on that, and as I hear, remind ourselves that we're sons and daughters of God, that you're becoming a man of God, a woman of God, and that can and should be, in fact, that's part of the high school struggle.
Of course.
Is how I put God into that. And then reflective time, prayer time, reflection, deep thought. I think that if we do more of that, it gives people more opportunity to consider, how do I fit with being that child of God? Okay, I like that. I will take that into consideration. Even in classes, make sure that the teachers do that with all their classes, but then collectively, for those that want to, and at times those who don't want to. Just read a Psychology Today article that said, if you want your children here, and this author in Psychology Today said, if you want them in church, they need to be in church. If you want them here, they need to be doing this. And so it's intentional, purposeful, just like your parents being intentional with enrolling you in Adventist education. That was huge.
I think that's a good place to land the plane.
Are we going to land the plane?
We can land the plane.
Land the plane. Thanks so much for tuning in. We'll catch you on the next one. Thanks so much for tuning into this episode of Faith Talk.
Check us out on all of our socials. That'll be Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, and all the above. We also are on YouTube.
And subscribe to all our channels, YouTube, Apple, Spotify, things like that.
And be sure to check out our merch store. It not only supports us, but it helps us bring you higher quality content.
Yeah, and remember, we got a weekly word on Wednesday every week on Get This Wednesday.
And episodes come out first of the month.
Thanks so much for watching. Hopefully we'll catch you on the next one.
God bless.